Speaking of predictions involving marketing and things like that, a lot of people started to talk about sort of the decline of desktops and consoles and the rise of mobile sort of things. And I know that Steam is working on the Steam Box. How do you predict that will affect the market compared to all the other things that are out there now?
You asked several questions. So Steambox, so the fact that, so there's this competition that goes on between open and closed platforms, right? Between open source and closed source, between, for a long time there were all these people creating private networks like Genie and AOL and IBM had one versus the internet. And the question becomes, what really are there are costs and benefits to both, but I'm always going to bet on open winning in the long run. To me, the living room has always sort of been artificially excluded from that. If you look at what happened in the business environments where the PC went from being this weird thing that was being snuck in by people in finance who didn't want to wait for the mainframe in order to do their spreadsheets, it just ate everything alive. So the IBM Selectric, which used to be a $3 billion a year business for IBM, was a typewriter, and now it's gone. Wang dedicated word processors, all the arguments you ever hear about the value of a fixed function device were made, about Wang dedicated word processors. Oh, you can't retrain secretaries, they'll never learn a new system. So, oh, PCs try to do too many things, they'll never be good at word processing as a system that's designed just for them. Oh, people have made a huge investment in these devices and they're not going to walk away. Boom! Like gone in 3 years. 3270 terminals used to be a huge business for all sorts of people. And nowadays, the idea that you would use anything other than a piece of software running on a standardized network with a standardized hardware just seems bizarre. Now, this notion that an open, standardized platform can't work in the living room, I think was really a result of at Microsoft, the height of Microsoft's market power. A group of people inside said, we don't want to work in the Windows group, so we're going to create this imaginary reason why the living room has to be carved off of what's happening in the rest of the company. And if you're willing to go lose $6 or $7 billion to create that, you could. But I do not think it's a smart strategy for customers or for software developers. I don't think it's a good strategy for Microsoft. So I think that we're going to see the PC expanding pretty quickly into the living room, replacing all of the closed proprietary systems that are there. So consoles are the most obvious, but all the other weird set-top boxes and things like that, I think will get vaporized in the same way that happened in business environments. The threat right now is that Apple has gained a huge amount of market share and has a relatively obvious pathway towards entering the living room with a closed with their platform. I think that there's a scenario where we see really sort of a dumbed down living room platform emerging. I think Apple rolls the console guys really easily. And the question is, can we make enough progress in the PC space to establish ourselves there and also start figuring out better ways of addressing mobile before Apple attacks or takes over the living room. So the way we see that happening is sort of through a three-tiered transition. Best really gets validated by good and better. So it's anything you want in your PC. It's like, oh, now that I've got a PC in my living room, I'll add more hard drive storage and whatever else it is that I like about my PC. Good is essentially treating your living room devices as a remote monitor and a remote input device. So I'll pick up a game controller, and my PC that's off in the den will be using Ethernet or wireless to you'll see in-home streaming, but it's actually a lot more like in-home multi-monitor with a really long cable. And I think a whole bunch of hardware companies are going to be releasing the products in the next 12 months. So you'll hear it referred to as Miracast, Shield from NVIDIA, lots of other people. There's just going to be a huge set of products that say, if you want something that's incredibly cheap, like at a price point well below anything the consoles will be able to reach, you're going to take advantage of a PC that's running somewhere in your house. Good is the thing, better is the thing that people call Steambox, which is, hey, we need to hit a price point. The PC needs to hit a price point in a living room friendly form factor so that the console guys can't argue, well, that thing is big and ugly, or it's too expensive, or too noisy. And we're working to both design our own and work with hardware partners to introduce that kind of box to the living room. It seems to be sort of like, it's like one of those things where afterwards it'll seem like it was really simple, when beforehand everybody sort of denied that it was possible. But I think that you'll see a lot of different really living room friendly form factors emerging. We're happy to do it if nobody else will do it, mainly because once we do it, then everybody else will pile on, and people will have a lot of choices, but they'll have those characteristics. You'll say, okay, well, I can buy a console, which assumes that I'm going to rebuy all my content and have a completely different video system. Oh, and I have a different group of friends, apparently. Or I can just extend everything I love about the PC and the internet into the living room. The biggest challenge, I don't think, is from the consoles. I think the biggest challenge is that Apple moves on the living room before the PC industry sort of gets its act together. Long answer. So what is our next idea about what games are? It's going to sound a little bit strange at first. It's that games are productivity platforms for maximizing the productivity of gamers in creating digital goods and services for other people. So it sounds like, where did the word, there was like no use of the word fun in there. So I think that I've convinced you that maybe all of the effort and all of the goods that you acquire in any individual game should have persistence, right? If I spend all this time getting a bunch of stuff and I don't want to play World of Warcraft anymore, I still should be able to say, oh, I want to play this other game. I want to go play, StarCraft 3 or, Counter-Strike, whatever we're going to call it, and get some value out of that. I should be able to exchange goods and services with across the widest possible domain. In terms of like MMO way of thinking of stuff, it's like every game is actually an instance dungeon of an underlying economy. And when I build stuff or work in one of those games, it's exchangeable and has value across all of them. And I think it's easy at this point, although it may have been not as easy a couple of years ago, to understand that user creating hats or weapon models and so on are examples of that. But we think that it's a much broader way that you have to think about productivity. And it's really a market-based mechanism that determines what is and isn't valuable. So one of the problems we tried to tackle was, we looked at a team like Navi. Who knows who Navi are? So we looked at a team like Navi and said, there's something wrong if these guys aren't making more money than they are making. So how can we help them have a better monetization strategy? So Navi is a Ukrainian Dota 2 team, and they're extraordinarily proficient at what they do. Like, the difference between them and mortals is just as large as the difference between a professional football player and me, right? There's no one at Valve, including Ice Frog, who's anywhere close to being on the same level as these players. So they have unique skills, and they're highly entertaining. If you haven't ever seen Dendy, he's a hilarious guy. He's one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. And he's just, like, he does all this crazy stuff, like he plays Crystal Maiden as Carrie with, Slave Furies, and you're like, oh my god, that's crazy! And my wife is saying, what the hell are you talking about? So we said, how can we figure out whether or not they're creating as much value, how can we have the community show that? So we created a system where you have banners, and you show banner, revenues get shared with Navi, and you occasionally will get a reward by showing your support for a team. Turns out the professional players are incredibly valuable, and they can make a lot more money once you put in place a framework that allows people, allows them to sort of better monetize. So that's an instance of the whole class of different kinds of things. So it's not just content, it's also things, like experiences or stores. So let's talk about that for a second. In this, yes?
Before you hop away from your mention of Dota 2 and Dota competitive, how do you think that, shall we call it Pro League, the esports community, is tied to games themselves? My perception from being here in Austin and being able to attend Lone Star Clash and so forth is that there are people who love to play the game, and there are some people who love the game enough to enjoy watching it. What's your sense of the relationship between the players and the developers in terms of creating the right mix for a community like that to evolve and actually develop a person?
So I think that in the same way that there are all sorts of different ways that people create value for other people. We think that the line between creator and consumer of that value is going to change constantly. And the role that you have is going to change depending upon context. We think the professional players are super valuable, and we're trying to put in place a way so that we can actually let people vote with their dollars, right? Which is a great, it's a great way of figuring that out. And it turns out that, Deadbee's making like $100,000 a year off of banner sales. So people are clearly, the signal is there. He should not stop being a pro player and go run the Ukrainian equivalent of a Waffle House, right? He's doing more, he's creating more value for a whole bunch of people by doing what he's doing than many of his other choices as to where he spends his time. And the key is to look, it seems like we're the bottleneck in terms of creating those frameworks for people to show that there is value. And I'm going to touch on one that will sound paradoxical as to what, using this framework and this way of thinking about things, we're going to make a set of changes, right? So, okay, go ahead. So right now, when people think of Steam, they say, okay, what's the difference between the evil Apple App Store and evil Steam, right? It's like, you kind of we're like, oh, but you can use it, blah, blah, blah. So we're like, okay, that's great. And then a couple of people in the indie game community actually sat down with us and said, here's how it could be better, right? So one of the worst characteristics of the current Steam system is that we become a bottleneck, right? There's like so much content coming at us that we just don't have enough time to turn the crank on the production process of getting something up on Steam, right? So whether we want to or not, we're creating artificial shelf space scarcity. So people are like, oh, I didn't get put up on Steam, bad Valve. And we're like, we didn't get to it because we have 400 other things in the queue. So the right way to do that is to make Steam essentially a network API that anyone can call. Now this is separate from issues about viruses and malware, but essentially it's like anybody can use Steam as a sort of a distribution and replication mechanism. It's the consumers who will draw it through. It's not us making a decision about what should or shouldn't be available. It's just, you want to use this distribution facility, it's there, right? And customers decide which things actually end up being pulled through. So Steam should stop being sort of a curated process and instead should just become a networking API. And this is sort of like how things evolve. You start off and there's, oh, this should be an operating system and this should be, oh, this is application level. There's a way of thinking about how you structure these things. And a big chunk of what Steam does needs to just become a generally available networking API. Another piece of Steam, is the store. And the store is this, I don't know about you, but I think the store is really boring. Right? It's like this super middle brow marketing, here are a list of features in our games. It's like, as a piece of, it's like, I'm never entertained by our store. I never go like, ooh, I get to go browse the store. How exciting. It's like, you know, this will be the driest and most boring encapsulation of all of these games. And it's, you know, it's targeted at some mythical median customer. And so what Steam instead, the stores instead should become user-generated content. Now, other companies can take advantage of this as well, but if a user can create his own store, essentially add an editorial perspective and content on top of the purchase process, and there's a market-based mechanism for valuing that so that people can't try to charge some sort of rent, you know, that is inconsistent with people's perceptions of their value, then we've created a mechanism where anybody, in the same way we've seen a huge upsurge in value through user-generated content of hats, we think that there's a lot of aggregate value that can be created by allowing people to create stores. Right? So store is just another piece of content that can be created by anyone that creates overall value for all of us collectively.
Would the store, would these be separate from Steam itself, or
Yeah.
could Steam change? Because if you're allowing users to upload everything that they have, would you self-moderate it in some way? Because if you get out of hand, people could upload things that maybe are quote-unquote quality products, or...
Well, mainly what we think of the store is essentially is an interface into stuff that's already on Steam. So it's not like you'll be uploading stuff. It's somebody else will put it up there. So if I think of who I would love to have, like, do you know people know who Yahtzee is? Right? So I'd buy stuff from Yahtzee. Or there was Old Man Murray. I would have bought everything from Old Man Murray. If you've never seen well, I guess I can't recommend it because it's kind of X-rated. They have, they're incredibly sarcastic and funny writers who wrote about games. And, you know, in the same way that I put up a banner to show support for Dendy or a banner to support Navi, I would preferentially go to review sites that actually told me the truth about games, you know, and then I would say, oh yeah, I'm going to show my support by buying through these guys. If you in fact are creating awareness of, you know, let's say, you know, you were one of the first people to play Minecraft, and you were like, dude, everybody needs to play Minecraft, right? Your role in expanding the audience for that should be rewarded, because I think collectively we all benefit from people in the community who are creating greater awareness or adding editorial content around these things. And I think pretty quickly people will figure out who are the store authors that they want their money to go to and who they aren't. So it's separating. It's like you don't lump together, you know, menu structures and hard drive interfaces, right? So essentially we're saying the notion of the store is separate from the underlying, you know, replication, virus checking, you know, functions of that. That these things should be separated and that everybody will benefit when those things are separated. Yes?
When you guys made those, you guys elected to commit a viewable rating system, and recently Dotabuff, they implemented one, and you guys updated it so that it would pretty much be, you guys made it so that they would not be able to access that anymore unless players allowed it. I was wondering what was your take on that, and will there ever be a rating system implemented directly into?
So the rating system they were using was like an internal one that we think is kind of crappy. So we think that the idea is fine, it was just lousy implementation. And the change that we made was specifically to give users more control over how their data was. And Dotabuff guys sort of wigged out about it. So we think that we still think we're sort of making the right decision on both of those, which is trying to provide a different, more robust mechanism so people know how well they play, and also making sure that people don't feel like... So one of the important characteristics of the system is how secure it feels to people, and that's true of identity, it's true of property rights and things like that. So it's something we're always conscious of, that we want to build systems which feel to people trustworthy, right? Because there's actually a lot of real economic value to having agents in the system behaving in a predictable fashion. And that includes us and what we allow or enable participants in the system to do. So it's kind of a long-winded way of saying we think we did the right thing, and what our motivations were.
Will you ever implement directly into the rating system?
Oh yeah, we're in the process of doing that. We think that the one that we have in right now, which DotaBuff is using, is actually a crappy one that we did before we had a better idea of how to do that. We want people to add value because that's what we think is the key to successful games going forward, is to enable people to do stuff like adding value by generating replays or commentary on replays, or coming up with clever ways of evaluating players or predicting which teams will win. All of those to us look like content creation. All of them look to us as things which we have to fit within a framework if we're properly designing it. One thing, especially for the economists in the audience, is why do we think PCs and the internet, or in general, or standardized open platforms are so important? We think that that's the best way to create innovation and competition, right? So it's a good set of rules for the game we're all playing, which is, how do we collectively benefit as much from our collective action as possible. Now, one of the things that I think is under-commented on in the economics literature is that the Moore's Law, people tend to focus on computation, but it's also true for both communication and access to data, that we're seeing this exponential decline in the costs of those as well, and that there are significant economic consequences to having all of that data and being able to communicate very efficiently, related to things like they reduce moral hazard, they reduce the asymmetry of information, all of those things are going to be beneficial. That our access, or your access from a desktop, will dwarf the amount of information that the CIA had 5 years ago, right? Just to be really concrete about how that affects things like moral hazard and agency costs. That it will be harder, and well, the great example is you can't lie to Reddit. Like, how many times have you guys seen people say something like, "Oh, we did this because it's good for customers," and Reddit goes, "Ah, you're lying to somebody." That's an example of information asymmetry disappearing, right? I think it'll be easier and easier for people to discover. Information discoverability is going to be a lot less. And you'll see me talk about it a little more, although I'm clearly running out of time. Another thing about closed platforms that I think is a negative is they increase the chunk size of competition. They create barriers that increase the cost of market entry. They also delay standardization. In general, given that I'm long over time, I would say that corporations are sort of pre-internet methods of organizing production and allocating capital. So you'll see more and more this just in the same way that if you have a properly implemented framework, that a game developer at a company can actually make more money just being the user inside of this framework. I think that you're going to see that that's a harbinger of what's going to be happening in a wide variety of industries. That the internet solves the set of problems that corporations solve. So one of the problems that you have as an economist is, why do corporations exist at all, right? Why do you need somebody organizing these kinds of things? Why isn't the price mechanism automatically helping you make the right decisions? If markets are super efficient, why isn't somebody calling you up and say, "Hey, I need this bit of writing," or "Hey, I need this bit of economic analysis," or whatever? Why isn't the market automatically making you as productive as possible without living inside of this corporation, which essentially looks a lot more like communist Russia than it does like an idealized free market? And the answer is, even if they used to make sense, I think they make a lot less sense in the future. That the fundamental structural things which that gave corporations an advantage, the internet solves much more robustly, and that the window of opportunity for corporations to evolve fast enough has probably already passed. And so that you'll see more and more industries shifting towards models that look like self-organizing groups on the internet than look like traditional corporations. And I think you'll see it happen in the game space first, simply because we live in this kind of cool world of digital goods and services, which make it, in the same way that it's easy to see huge productivity variance in programmers, because there's a lot of the things that make it hard for a great, manager, their productivity variation is harder to be visible without a lot of baggage distorting the signal. I think video games are likely to be the place where those kinds of advantages in organizing production occur first. I think you already can see that in weird ways in things like maker fairs, where the amount of creativity and interesting product designs that are enabled by these self-directing, self-organizing groups seems to be a lot greater than you'd see out of like a consumer electronics company like Panasonic. I actually think that that's significant, and we'll continue to see that evolve. Then I get this whole section about why I decided to be a machinist that is too long.
Can I ask you one quick question, Dan?
Yep.
You spoke about corporations and being pre-internet constructs. What do you think about government organizations? Just the LBJ, just a little question.
Well, one of the topics that I talk with Giannis a lot about is dispute resolution. And right now we have, inside of Steam, dictatorship, right? So there's no trial by jury. Like we just say, you're a hacker, boom, ban your account. Or you're a pirate, and hey, when you're the dictator, it's kind of cool. But it's not clear that that's a good long-term design of a dispute resolution system. And that dispute resolution systems have consequences on the audience that's using those. In other words, it's probably bad for the meme community in the long run not to move to a different way of thinking about that. In other words, we should stop being a dictator and move towards much more participatory, peer-based methods of sanctioning player behavior. So to the degree to which we're a political institution, we're trying to think of how to be more consistent with our own ideas in implementing those kinds of things. Green light is a bad example of an election process that we came to the conclusion pretty quickly that we should just do away with green light completely, and because it was a bottleneck rather than a way for people to sort of communicate choice. So yeah, if you ask me if I thought that we won't have internet scale political institutions, I'd say they're probably already starting to exist, and it will be interesting to watch how those things interact with traditional political structures over the next 20 years. But yeah, I absolutely think that the same arguments I make about corporations are applicable to a lot of government institutions. Blah, blah. The relative discovery, transactional, organizational costs are plummeting, and that's fundamentally what's going to eliminate the advantage that corporations have had over things like the price mechanism or other methods of organization in the years to come. And I also think that the rate of change that we're going through, just sort of technologically in general, shifts advantages away from specialized organizations towards generalist individuals. You know, it just seems to be a consequence of how quickly things change, that the value of specialization decreases because the domain in which specialization has incremental advantages decreases, so it's just not worth it to become a specialist. I do think specifically that we'll end up seeing the virtual goods and services will be much, much larger than the physical goods and services, which will seem really weird to a whole bunch of people who are like, it's just all bullshit. And you'll be like, yeah, but a lot of people are really happy and create a lot of value for other people through it. So it's interesting to try to actually come up with a metric which everybody will agree reflects the relative contribution of those segments of the overall economy. That I think regardless of how you pick it, that way sooner than most people expect, the virtual goods and services will dwarf it. And for those of you who like science fiction, there's this great researcher at Cornell who's done a bunch of work decoding how to talk directly to your brain, sort of bypassing, you know, the front end of your optical system. In other words, she's actually just skipping the eye and talking directly into people's brains, which really introduces sort of a bizarre snow crash reality way sooner than I would have guessed. So she's solving the coding problem. It's like the how do you turn it, how do you know, there's this sort of CCD front end problem, which is kind of hard. And she's like, well, that's a bitch. Why don't we just skip that, figure out what the protocol is to talk to the brain. And it turns out one of the interesting things is it's a way more compact representation of information. So, you know, that's going to happen. You know, that's something that you guys should be thinking about. That your subjective experience of reality is probably going to be driven directly into your brain much sooner than I think most people expect. Which means you'll be playing games and we win. Thank you.